and there are some ground rules, so I will start up with the introduction. Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Margaret Nesaraj and I will be the moderator for this breakout room. Before we begin, I would just like to take a minute to go over some ground rules to ensure all our presenters and guests have a positive and educational experience. We ask that anyone who is not presenting to keep their cameras and mic off during the presentation. This will help eliminate any background noise and distractions. If you have a question or a comment, please type it in the chat and we will go through them at the end during our Q&A session. Presentation need to stay within the allotted time, 15 minutes. When the time is up, I will ask the presenter to wrap up to the point so we can move on to the next presentation. This is to ensure that all our colleagues have time to share their research. Lastly, we would like to remind everyone that the session is being recorded. Thank you. Now we will move on to the first presentation.
Hi there. Sorry, I seem to have a bit of a delay right now. I'm just going to share my screen, so it's catching up here. But thank you, Margaret, for moderating for us. Okay, it should come soon. You're able to see it now? Great, thank you. Thanks, Joel. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm not going to be reading from a document. I'm going to basically tell the story of this experience of trying to better understand the systems within which international students, in my experience or in my classes, have been trying to operate. And so I'll give you a bit of context. And then talk a little bit very briefly about some theoretical concepts that I've been playing around with and thinking about. And then I'll provide an example with a bit of sort of the qualitative research or the feedback, and then go into what I've sort of uncovered so far. Please note that this has been sort of an ongoing thought process. I don't want to call it research yet because it's not quite where I would hope it could be. But right now it's really an exploration of what I've been noticing in classes, what I've been trying to do with students, how I'm trying to support them, etc. And as you can see, I'm based at the University of Windsor currently. And so the circumstances that we all found ourselves in, probably around the same time, for us in particular at Windsor, it was March of 2020, where the decision was made by the institution to move to fully online teaching. And we had a few days to do that, to make that big shift. And then, of course, since then, I would say the majority of us have been working online. In some cases, some of the classes are asynchronous and online. In some cases, they're combined, both asynchronous or synchronous. In my case, I'm referring to two specific courses. The one that's listed first, the Engineering Technical Communications, I teach with a team, a faculty team. So there are several of us who teach this course. And what we've done as a collective is we've created asynchronous content that students will, we use Blackboard, so the students go into Blackboard, they go through, weekly modules, some videos, some other readings, etc. And then they meet with us individually for our own sections. They meet with us synchronously in a live session, again through Blackboard. The second course, pardon me, the second course I'm referring to, Emerging Paradigms in Computing Technologies. Sounds a bit funky probably. It's basically a computer science course that's devoted to learning about emerging technologies, but we focus on sort of teaching the students how to do research as high-level professionals, but also on delivering that research. So I like to think of it as sort of veiled professionalization and veiled technical communications. In the veil itself is emerging technologies in some way. And so far, in both of these courses since March, I've worked with approximately 400 or so international students, all at graduate level, and approximately 7 or so countries have been represented. So as you are probably all fully aware, there's lots of challenges with figuring out time zones and expectations and that kind of thing. So now I want to talk a little bit about the learning goals and theories that have sort of started to drive the work that I'm doing. So as I mentioned, the crux of both of these courses, of course, I'm boiling it down from lists of learning outcomes, but the crux of these courses, the way I see it, is really about communicating technical concepts or translating technical expertise for a broad range of audiences. So in both of these courses, the students are technical experts. They have strong backgrounds in either engineering or computer science and any number of the branches of either of those disciplines. And so when they come to the courses that I'm teaching, they're really hoping to learn a bit more about sort of a quote unquote Canadian context, so Canadian professional context. And I recognize that that in itself can be problematic to label it in that way. But that's what they typically tell me that they're thinking about is I want to work or I want to come to Canada. I want to figure out how to get a job. I want to do well. I want to progress in my career, etc. And so what I started working with in terms of in the back end, right? I'm not talking with the students about the theory necessarily at this point, but what I started thinking through was the Vygotsky, von Glossersfeld, and the Mayer work that I've listed here. Of course, all of these folks have copious amounts of research to their names, but I'm boiling again down to very brief concepts here. So with Vygotsky, thinking about the zone of proximal development, and again, sort of very simplified version of it, is thinking about how I can engage students in a way that supports them to do independent problem solving or independent thinking, but then also thinking about how we sort of bridge this gap to getting them to think through in a quote unquote professional way. Right, so we think of them as students who are professionalizing, if I could use that term, but we're also trying to figure out how do I sort of orient the students and the concepts and the content so that they're able to start thinking in the way that I or another professional would start thinking in a work environment. So it's a very practical, or the goal is very practical, right? We're not so focused on, or I could say I'm not so focused on saying, you know, can they identify these theories? I'm more focused on saying they're finding themselves in a meeting with a CEO and suddenly they have to present on the work they're doing. Are they ready to jump into action, right? And how do I try to fill that gap in some way or support the gap filling, if I could say it that way? When we think about the von Glossersfeld work, a lot of the ideas start to rely on the social constructivism concept. So thinking about around interactivity, the social connections, the interactions among peers or among students who are all sort of moving forward in the same process. So the process that I or other faculty have tried to create for them, and how do we bring that as part of the way that the students can start to learn this stuff, this work. And then of course, Mayer came in 2004 and was quite critical, especially of the constructivist kind of movement, talking about more, from his perspective, more about wanting students to learn by thinking and by guided doing, not just about the students being able to do this work on their own and somehow magically become proficient in a particular skill or a concept, but actually having sort of the facilitation process as being important. And so this is where I started digging through a little bit, thinking, okay, how do I really conceptualize what I'm trying to do in these classes? And then I started adding on, I'll go to the next slide here. I started adding on some other concepts that I had worked on or worked with in other contexts outside of academia. And so this is where, for me, the international student experience becomes especially, I would say, optimistic. There's a wonderful opportunity when we have international students coming together in a class where we have the world with us together, right? We are a collective reflecting any number of countries and experiences and language and histories and challenges and all kinds of things. And so in my mind, I was thinking about how do we then, or how might I support these students to think of their work not just within the disciplinary boundaries that post-secondary typically requires of us, right? How do I try to start to dismantle some of the silos that we often see in post-secondary? And in my mind, that comes through things like Donella Meadows and systems thinking. It comes through Ashoka, which is a nonprofit global organization that focuses on what they call change making, which of course is a phrase well used in the English language. But their concept of change making is that everyone can be a change maker, from the youngest child to the oldest adult, from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of experiences, all kinds of circumstances. And so the idea with Ashoka, or their model of change making, is not that you must be part of a privileged set of individuals who has access or has opportunity to make change, but that as an individual in a particular circumstance, you see the possibility, you have the wherewithal, and you have the self-awareness and the self-efficacy, really, to say that I can create change in this world when I see it necessary. And then, of course, adding in some older work from Collins and a few other folks, referring to sort of cognitive apprenticeship and thinking about how do we make better or clearer lines or clearer awareness and connections of how we actually engage in this work. And so when I say this work, for me, it refers to, yes, systems change, leading with empathy, that kind of thing, but also how do I, as an instructor, take the understanding of what professional environments might require of the students, and how do I sort of help them to go through that in a course, in a 12-week semester, basically, and help them take it all further. And so what this has come to be, I'll give you an example next. What this has come to be in practical terms, in my mind, has been a lot of activities and a lot of work that rely on kind of quasi real life scenarios. And so this is one example just from one of the courses. So this is the Emerging Technologies course from last semester, from winter term. And so this is the scenario that we used throughout the semester to inform how we were conducting our research, how we were preparing artifacts. Artifacts were documents and series of documents such as business cases. They prepared budgets, they prepared presentations, they conducted debates on ethical implications of their emerging technologies. They learned the depth of their work by thinking about this scenario. And so, of course, we're reaching a few different levels of cognition. We're thinking about, Bloom's taxonomy. We're thinking about all these different types of learning goals and learning outcomes. But for the students, it really comes down to how am I applying my technical expertise to a potential real scenario. And so, as you can see, I made this up. No one got $20 million, very sadly, but basically it was suggesting that the University of Windsor was partnering with eCampus Ontario. For those who are not familiar, eCampus Ontario is an organization basically through the provincial ministry here that handles post-secondary education, and they have funding, they do research, they do a bunch of cool things or interesting things related to virtual learning or just online access to knowledge, etc. And so I was suggesting here that they're giving us $20 million for 5 years to just figure out how to improve distance ed. And so what the students were doing in studying technologies like blockchain, 5G, cloud computing, edge computing, fog computing, all these different types of technologies, they were actually trying to figure out, okay, if this is what this technology does or can do, or that we know it can do at this moment, what could it mean for this particular application? And so as the students were doing this work, we started talking more about ethics. We started talking more about use case models or actor mapping, or how do you figure out user experience, right? How do you start with empathy in order to go into a design process to figure out how the users are going to interact with your technology? And so having the real life scenario really seemed to bring the students together in a, in this case, particularly Ontario-centric kind of scenario or experience. But what it also did was allowed students to now have some language and some context that they could discuss if and when they're in an interview scenario. Right. So if an interviewer comes in and says, okay, tell me about some of the teamwork you've done, or you know, what do you think about your technology or the work that you study, the students are then able to bring it to this very real experience that we did for, you know, about 4 months. So they're able to process and discuss and translate a lot of that work into something specific that, you know, an interviewer might want to hear, for example. Now, there are other examples with the engineering course where, as a team, we ask the students to focus on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We have them doing specific work, but of course, we only have a few minutes here today, so I don't want to, you know, pull everything in. I just want to share here a couple of results. So this is some of the student feedback based on that computer science course. I'll leave you to read most of it yourself, but basically in these two responses, these are from two different students. What I was seeing is that the challenge or the difficulty.
1 more minute up.
Okay.
Kindly wrap up.
Sure, Margaret, thank you. Was the challenge of figuring out empathy and figuring out how to do the online experience simultaneously. And so the students really grappled with that throughout the semester and came into some realizations. Now, this is the last slide I'll show. I'll just kind of leave it up here as we end the session. Is some of the influencers that I started to find for the students' experience in the virtual learning and teaching and learning environment related everything from practicality like time zones and figuring out where to meet in Blackboard to figuring out how to shift from a knowledge consumer to someone who actually has agency and is able to see potential for social impact or change globally. And so you can see that there's quite a few different influences that seem to come out of this, and the entire system, this whole system of influences, of course, is affecting the students individually and as a collective in our class. So again, this is research that I'm continuing to do, and hopefully we'll have some really concrete stuff to go forward. So thank you very much. I can pass it over, and if anyone has any questions or would like more information, please do feel free to reach out. So thank you very much.
Thank you. If anyone has questions, please put it in the chat box. We will be addressing it at the last after all the presentation is over. Now we will be moving on to the next presentation. If you have not turned on the live captions, please do it.
Okay, Ismail, can you see our slides on there?
Yes.
Okay. So you just let me know when you want me to move them forward, I guess, yeah?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everybody. And this project, which, you know, we did together with, well, I did together with Dr. Steve Marshall and Dr. Joel Henk-Hartzy. So in this project, we looked at students' experiences of learning academic literacies after the pivot to remote instruction. So second language writers, that is. So could you, the conceptual lens that we use to frame this study essentially is academic discourse socialization, which looks at how newcomers to the academic community, in this case, second language writers, learn the academic practices, academic literacies and discourses of the academic community. And could you change to, all right. So essentially, academic discourse socialization posits that learning is mediated through interaction. Interaction with peers, interaction with instructors, friends, people, and then one's networks. And also through interactions with model texts, websites, and peer feedback. And it can occur in both formal and informal contexts. So more broadly, this lens is academic literacies, right? So, and it is predicated on the view of learning, essentially as, and in this case, writing up as a social practice that is embedded in the context, in the sociocultural context. So in this lens, actually, issues of identity and epistemology and learning as being socially constructed are the main considerations. So could you move on to the next slide? Sure. So there is little research in this vein in socialization that has looked at how socialization in digital contexts occurs. So in part, actually, we were interested in how this happens, particularly after the pivot to remote instruction, and how, given the main things in socialization that happened, the main assumption and that learning occurs through interaction. Now, given the shift to remote instruction, how students learning of and socialization into academic literacies is influenced in a sense. So I'm going to pass it over to Steve to talk about the course and the context.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
And thanks everyone for coming. I can see some familiar names on the list, but not faces. So we're talking about a course which we've called ALC, Academic Literacies Course. It's a first-year course for students who haven't met the university's literacy requirement, which means they have to get above 70% in their grade 12 English. And if they get between 70 and 75% in their final English score, they have to take the first-year academic literacy course, or if their IELTS score is below 7. In the course, there's no separation between students according to their linguistic backgrounds or according to their levels at which they enter the university. Around 90% of the students report using a language other than English at home, but we do have around 10%, sometimes more, in a class who describe being mainly English speakers or monolingual. And yeah, we have students from the whole linguistic spectrum. Could we move on? Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay.
I did do it. Yeah, I'm on a bit of a delay from you. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. So yeah, I think like elsewhere, we received an email on a Friday in March saying that everything was going to remote learning by Tuesday next week. So it was quite a fast and frantic switch for us all. And so we've got 3 terms of exclusive remote learning from which we're drawing the data. And most instructors switched immediately to Zoom. Some others used Blackboard Collaborate. Okay, next slide, please. Can you hear my dog barking?
Yeah.
The project. We've called the project Exploring Student and Instructor Experiences with Remote Instruction in a First-Year Academic Literacy Course. And our research questions are: what are students' and instructors' experiences, both positive and otherwise, with remote delivery of the course? And what are the factors that are facilitating or constraining learning in this remote environment? Today, we're going to focus exclusively on data from students and focusing also on the topic of peer relations. So it's a small-scale qualitative study. We've interviewed 7 students and 2 instructors, and the students also filled out a questionnaire about their experiences. Next one, yeah. So what are our preliminary findings? On one level, it seems that nothing much is different. They view their experiences as pretty much similar to other courses. But one thing that surprised us was some of the students were really positive about remote learning, but not because of any sort of pedagogical, theoretical perspective, but really on practical grounds. It meant they didn't have to have long commutes across the city. It meant if they had a class at 10 a.m. and another one at 4, they didn't have to hang around on campus all day. So that was quite surprising for us. But one of the issues that really came up were themes around isolation and disconnection from peers. So
I think that's what we're going to focus on here, and I think the next is the excerpts of data. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So as we started to read through the data and focus on these things that kept popping up in the student participants, what we're going to present here is some excerpts that show from the interviews that show kind of these themes. So I probably won't read these whole slides, but I'll let you take a look at them and maybe point out some of the highlights here. So you can see this student talking about the inability to kind of connect with peers from a similar background and create WeChat groups and create sort of study groups or groups where they can discuss how things are going for them. I'll just give you a few seconds to look at that. Ismail or Steve, you can feel free to jump in at any point too. I think the final sentence here, everyone just disappeared, is typical of some of the responses we saw. Another student also talks about not being able to connect with speakers of their first language, which often happens in this course. So I didn't have, and I think this is something like I didn't have the chance to connect with other people. I don't know who shares my language background. I can't see them, I can't speak to them. So they're not able to kind of create those groups. Just giving you a little time to read before I move on. Another one talking about kind of the silence, right? Missing the group discussion, that kind of instant feedback. You turn and talk to the person right there. You can't sit there in silence in person, right? But in Zoom, that was missing. So I would rather resort to not speaking up, someone else asking, or just typing in the chat. Can I ask someone to mute themselves there? So we have some background noise. Thanks. Another one similarly talking about a group chat. I never saw a group chat meetup for the course or anything. That would be more helpful. I like to know if other people are understanding things in the same way I am. I just want to see where everyone is at, and they felt they couldn't do this in the Zoom format. Couple more here. Again, talking about isolation, right? Both of these students, I feel kind of isolated. Even when I do kind of connect with people online, I don't get an answer for a few days. Second one here, I felt I was doing the course alone. I didn't approach anyone. I wouldn't know how to. So again, pervasive sense of isolation or difficulty connecting. And I think this is the final one here. I remember the instructor put us in groups. No one talked in my group. No one ever said anything. Everyone's camera was off. It doesn't feel real. The other people don't feel real, so nobody even talked. And maybe some of you can relate to these sort of painful experiences that you may have had. So in terms of thinking about what the students said in the interviews and how it relates to academic discourse socialization or kind of the social uptake of academic literacy learning, which is the goal of the course, we find that remote learning has broken down traditional peer learning networks. A very important resource for making meaning and for learning academic literacy has been, the students feel at least, lost. Now, of course, we know that students often like to connect digitally, but it seems that that lack of face-to-face interaction or that lack of kind of embodiedness leads to, oh, I've lost my PowerPoint suddenly. Looks like someone else has shared a PowerPoint. Would you mind taking that down? Can you guys still see my, I see someone else's PowerPoint on the screen.
You can share that. They will be automatically disconnected from sharing.
Okay.
Okay, somebody's done by mistake.
Okay. So our slides are gone still? I don't see them.
Can you try sharing it again?
I can try, yes. All right, it's just loading, just a moment.
Okay.
I don't know how that happened.
But I think it's theoretically apt, just as you're talking about
disruption.
disconnections. So kind of, it's actually, it's really helpful. It actually illustrates the point you're talking about when things mess up.
Thank you. Okay, so are we seeing slides now?
Yep.
Okay. Give me a moment here. Sorry. Okay, are you seeing that one?
Yeah.
Great. So as I was saying, we're disembodied and digital disruption. Students are disembodied from imagined communities, communities that are created on the first day of class when they meet each other and find students from peers from similar backgrounds and are then able to take those connections forward to support their learning. That's been lost. Similarly, I guess there's a loss of that physical space to exercise agency in constructing plurilingual or pluricultural identities. So you'll see those references in the data to, I couldn't meet people, I couldn't tell who speaks my first language. Normally I would meet other Mandarin speakers and we would connect, but I wasn't able to do that. And that's unfortunate and quite interesting. So in terms of the practical applications, what can we do? What are the implications from this data? How do we teach online to help students develop those healthy peer networks that will facilitate academic socialization and literacy learning? We want to create opportunities, if we can, to work in small groups, not always just in the Zoom where there's no one, no one turning their screen on, but also asynchronously. Open up spaces for language awareness. Talk about language backgrounds. I do an activity about language repertoires, what languages are part of your life meaningfully, these types of things. Beginning classes with a warm-up or community building prompt can be really helpful just for students to feel, again, that they're real, which one student said they did not. Offering opportunities for students to e-meet, whether it's one-on-one together or one-on-one with the instructor, also helps to create that. Finding ways for students to get to know each other beyond just the large, large-scale class with Zoom class with the cameras off. Find ways to meaningfully use the chat or group chats to promote interaction, right? We find that kind of meta commentary on the class can take place in the chat in a useful way if that's cultivated by the instructor. And similarly, encouraging students to do group chats, mentioning it if no one has brought it up, right? How can you promote that with the students? And then finally, this question of complaining that people aren't using their cameras. Oh, I've lost my PowerPoint again. I think someone else has taken over again. Well, that was the final slide, so I'll just finish.
Yeah, still you can go ahead and share it again.
It would take too long, and that was the final slide, so it's okay. What was I talking? Oh, yeah, students don't turn their cameras on for a variety of reasons. They just woke up, they don't have their makeup on, they feel self-conscious, they're at home with their family, and there's a lot of chaos. We need to be, more compassionate and understanding here. About why they're doing what they're doing as we try to create these opportunities for socialization. So I don't know if Steve or Ismail wants to add one final thought.
All good from me. I think you covered everything very well. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about those problems there. I'm not sure what that was, but so that's it for us. I did have some contact info on there, but I guess just if you want to get in touch with us, you can let us know in the chat. We can meaningfully use the chat function as a way to create community and promote academic literacy. So thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Steve and Ismail, and look forward to your questions after the next presentation. Thanks a lot.
Okay, if anyone has questions, please put it in the chat box. It will be addressed after all the presentations are over. Thank you. Now we will be moving on to the last presentation.
Hi, folks. Sorry to Doctors Harte and Marshall there. That I don't know how my PowerPoint popped up. My apologies. My name is Thomas Pappy. I am with Grand Canyon University in the College of Doctoral Studies, and my research is predominantly qualitative, focusing on the benefits of mentoring teams that we put together at a Midwestern American University circa 2020. Okay. So can everybody see my screen there? It looks like it's cutting off. I'm not sure if you can see the entire thing. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, we are able to see. You can go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah. So what we know about mentoring is that it's usually a person who is, just to recap, is in a higher level of knowledge, mentoring somebody who is less experienced or knowledgeable in a certain content area. And so we even see situations where there's reverse mentoring, where someone is younger, training or mentoring somebody who is older than they are, perhaps regarding something pertinent to technology. So my program chair came to me and said, we want to develop a community of doctoral faculty who we can kind of get together, and not in this large ecosystem where people are coming from these interdisciplinary fields, but to kind of break and chunk them off into groups of 20, where we can create sort of this sort of informal learning community. So if you and I were in this informal community, she kind of phrased it to me similar to if we were at a bar having a glass of wine or a beer or a Coke or something like that. We would not be formal. We would be sort of laid back, talking shop. In my mind, I schematically looked at it as maybe if we were in the living room of our home, talking about what we do best. So we know that universities can be complex places with differences between faculty and administration. But within our College of Doctoral Studies and in other doctoral programs, you have people from different background and training. And so we want to be able to bring them together instead of a community of practice to highlight their skill sets. And so we had 4 different types of doctoral programs at this Midwestern University with over 70 mentors. And so we were dividing them into 3 different constellations. We called the Mentor Constellation Project, to divide them into 3 different groups of 20 plus mentors and 3 mentors and 20 plus mentees in each mentor constellation group, each with these eclectic backgrounds to help our students persist ultimately through their capstone projects for their doctorates in education. So these capstones centered around curriculum product proposals, action research monographs, program evaluations, or change management plans. And so faculties come with different worldviews. And so you might have a faculty member working with somebody on a change management plan, a mentee, that is. And so this faculty member might need the help of other people in the constellation to help them guide this learner, because their background might be more aligned with curriculum product development. So how does it work? You know, or why does it work, or does it work at all? We get together informally, and then we bring up topics of the day, very, very informally. Mentoring is not new, but the informality of this group is what made it kind of unique, because usually when there is a group that meets, there's usually must-know messages or a scripted agenda. This mentor constellation group, each of the 3 groups, was distinctly informal and designed to sort of discuss, you know, what's going well in these courses in terms of the technical components working in Blackboard, but also guiding your learners through the action research monograph or the curriculum product. And so in this community of practice, you know, we were able to, you know, answer sort of these questions for these new faculty and even the experienced faculty. And so we created a faculty mantra, and I'm not going to read the entire thing to you, but it was basically a one for all for one approach, where we provided connections to share our concerns and celebrate our accomplishments. So when we had learners that graduated with their capstone projects, through these EDD capstones, not dissertations, but capstones. We would celebrate those successes and congratulate the mentor for a successful journey with their mentee, who would ultimately graduate. These were full-time faculty and even part-time and adjunct faculty who were comprised in these constellations. And so developing this mantra gave us sort of this unity and this voice, which we created during our mentor calls, which were, as I mentioned in the last slide, informal, maybe once a week. Attendance was not mandatory. We purposely left it informal because we wanted to create an atmosphere of comfort and something that people would enjoy going to, rather than say, oh my gosh, we have this meeting to attend again. So in meeting one, there were different, so my screen is cut off so I can read the last three to you. You know, the purpose of these meetings was to sort of create a community where there was collegiality. We wanted every voice heard. Unlike some meeting groups where you have maybe one or two people who talk and dominate the conversation, mentor leads, each of these three would go around to each person and include everybody. And share best practices for student persistence. Because when you go to school online, you have a lot of adult learners, particularly with adult learners, who drop out for a number of different reasons. Some of it relates to life stressors, but also because they can't always do the work, and so that matters. This was something that we made a point to make every person heard. In the second group, they created active email threads. They invited communication via text, phone calls, Adobe Connect meetings. And they end the quarter with sort of like this sort of summative conversation regarding what did we learn here? What did we learn about milestone progress? So in this institution, students would progress through a series of 5 milestones in order to graduate. And so getting learners through milestone 1 to 5 could be a pretty difficult task. So part of what this community would do was share best practices during these sort of very informal phone calls, while at the same time celebrating life events like my son graduated from college, or we had a baby, or something like that, to make the calls meaningful, personal, and just to include people. In the third constellation group, more of the same. They would look at developing an action plan, a plan of action for learners at the beginning of the course, and hold them to that as a way to try to increase persistence in our programs. Helping learners with time management and time management suggestions like calendars or updates, announcements, was something that came out of this mentor group. Asking lots of questions, and then really what this group determined is that it feels more like a community now. They felt like they belonged to something. We also discussed different things that were specific to the capstone project, like hiring copy editors, addressing learner complaints, explaining faculty expectations. All of these things were very, very important. That we tried to, I'm trying to advance my screen here. I can't seem to do it. If I can right arrow. My screen is frozen here. I can't move it to the next slide.
Can you try stopping the screen share and sharing it again?
Sure. Oops. See if I can do this again. So in any case, I don't need the PowerPoint up to share the rest of it. Basically, what we did was we collected data on each of these three constellation groups of approximately 20 to 25. And so we did this through qualitative means. We conducted surveys. We sent out roughly about 70 and received a response of approximately 50. So 2/3, 70% of respondents.
Sorry to interrupt. We are still not able to see your screen. I mean the slides.
Yeah, I am not sure why, because I had it up. Let me see if I can.
Okay, fine. Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I will try one more time. It just says PowerPoint not available. All kinds of technical difficulties. Sorry about that, folks. But basically, there were 5 themes that emerged from the surveys that were compiled qualitatively, and also the focus groups that we ran. 3 focus groups. Each mentor lead ran the focus groups, and so data was coded, and we came up with 5 primary themes. And the first theme was one of understanding, and that the mentor constellation created a greater understanding on the topic of action research. Some people came from qualitative or quant or mixed methods research and weren't familiar with action research, which is designed to address problems of professional practice. So the mentor constellation group provided them with better understanding on action research, which in turn helped them with their learners reach their milestones. The second theme that came from the focus groups and the surveys was one of technical proficiency, in which the mentor was able to answer questions more quickly with a quicker turnaround time, with more technical proficiency, not just in Blackboard, but also how to answer questions with respect to the capstone process in terms of, let's say you were doing a change management plan. You had to use a theoretical model of change. And so Cotter's 8 steps of change was discussed during these groups, and which in turn was transmitted to the learner in terms of how to sort of look at their change management plan along these 8 steps. Or if you were doing a curriculum product proposal, knowledge of the ADDIE instructional design model versus Agile. Mentors became more proficient as we discussed these things during the constellation group, which in turn helped learners. The third theme that emerged was one of inclusion, in which faculty did not feel alone. That was very important. That was the goal. We wanted to have every voice heard, as I mentioned from the first constellation group. And we saw more active participation. So even though we didn't get 20 people at every constellation meeting, you might get 6 to 8, but those 6 to 8 people, if they showed up, were actively participating. If we had 10 or 12, they were participating because of the informality and the fact that they weren't being managed through fear, with sort of this didactic, you got to do this, you got to do this, you got to do this. The fourth theme that emerged was one of confidence, increased confidence in mentorship or mentoring, increased confidence in how to use the learning management system in Blackboard, and that people felt confident because the mentor leads were supportive and responsive. So as a sub-theme to that confidence primary theme. And the fifth theme represented opportunities for improvement. And so when we collected the data via these focus groups and surveys, people thought, well, it'd be nice to have a common place to store items of interest, such as paperwork and documents that students have to submit, such as to an institutional review board or something like that. Some mentors, PhD faculty, full-time and part-time, suggested that it would be great if we could have targeted meetings with decision makers, which was important, and have a go-to list of constellation members based on their expertise, which is a great suggestion, because if we have out of 70 faculty, if we have 20 who are proficient in curriculum products, we want to connect those people with the right with the right mentors or right faculty, to do that. So aligning people that way. Then they have more professional team building activities and exercises was another sub-theme that emerged from the opportunities for improvement theme. In terms of future goals, we want to see increased attendance and participation. We're hoping that you don't want to make these things mandatory because it defeats the purpose of having sort of this informal constellation, but we're hoping that the more information that we can share and the more collegial we can make the group, more people will want to attend and participate. We now live in a COVID world. Having an annual face-to-face meeting was a goal. I think it could be a goal once we return to a more increased state of normalcy. And then to have sort of a social media page, like on Workplace or LinkedIn or some group that people can go to externally and also do things that way. And just what I learned from the experience is that there's so much knowledge, not just on this call, but in any type of mentor call. You really want to harness strengths. This mentor constellation really, from my vantage point, took a systems thinking approach. And so, we don't want people working in silos. We want them working across departments and across fields to harness knowledge and strengths. So in terms of a future opportunity for research, I would like to
One more minute left.
Yeah, I would like to see a constellation of this nature done in even a more technical field, like computer information systems or mathematics or accounting, to see how something like that works. So just want to thank everybody for their time, and sorry for the technical difficulties, but I look forward to talking to you more about it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. If anyone has questions, please post it in the chat. So I have a few questions. So what would be the best way to avoid student distractions when we are doing a class online? This is for team 2.
I can't even prevent being distracted when I'm online. What do you think, Steve?
Best way to gain attention is to have interesting content, engaging content. And what I found with the use of breakout rooms is when I started teaching online, I would just put them in breakout rooms and leave them. And I found that the students really weren't too engaged. So I started trying out other things, like assigning tasks. So say, okay, you're in breakout rooms of 4. Okay, one of you is a note taker who's going to post the key points in the chat afterwards. One of you is the person dealing with questions and answers. And the other 2 are looking at this, that, and the other. So I kind of assign roles and try and find ways to engage them, as I would if I was walking around in a classroom face-to-face. If I see a group who aren't really looking engaged, I kind of go in and try and motivate them. So that was one way that I think it worked quite well.
Yeah, that's great. Many times we see students, they are telling the staff that they don't have any questions or they don't have any doubts, but when we are physically present in a classroom, the lecturers and the professors will be able to get their emotions and reactions to the content, but it is quite challenging when we are doing it online. So is there a way we can handle that?
I think it's just a matter of doing whatever you can to check it. One of the things I found valuable about our class was I did a lot more one-on-one check-ins with the students, and we can do that because we have a small class. I mean, we only have 17, 18 students in these writing and literacy classes. But when I saw, I mean, I'll admit, I did away with peer review even, which is like one of the main things we do, just because it was hard to get students to connect. But as soon as I saw they were having trouble connecting, I started trying to build those connections more with them. So the one-on-one meeting with the professor, which I normally do 3 times per term anyway, became like the contact point for the class. And several students said that was the thing they appreciated. They could at least meet with me and get some feedback in those meetings. So in the smaller meetings, they seem to be more comfortable than the big meetings. And a lot of students said, well, I'm in these like 100, 200 person classes. We all just turn our cameras off and listen because it's a lecture. And they bring that into the smaller class even. So anyway, yeah, that's how I thought.
Yeah, and maybe one thing I would add is don't be afraid of the silence. So when there's a long silent period where nobody's doing anything, nobody's answering, let it kind of play out its momentum, because students are thinking. I mean, some of them sure will be distracted, but students are thinking. And then so try and use that quiet time as well. And also you can even build that in. You can say, I'm going to give you a 3 or 4 minute period here. I just want you to think. And you can turn off your cameras, turn off your microphones, and just think. So just be flexible and creative, I suppose.
The major challenge now is that the time zone differences, because most of the students are stuck in their home countries and they have difficulties adjusting to that. So that might be one of the reasons for distraction. Okay, thank you, Team 2. Now I have a few questions for Group 3. What are the challenges in Agile when we are working online? So what kind of challenges does Agile face?
Well, for me, they face multiple challenges. If they have ADHD or something of that nature, it's tough to stay focused. Not all children are self-directed. I work mainly with adults within this, serving adults in the mentor constellation and adult learners, in my work. But even they have trouble staying self-directed. So it's keeping people connected and motivated. That's a challenge. So making learning interesting and fun and meaningful requires talent. Not everyone can teach, as we know. So this is a science as much as it is an art.
Yeah, Agile team works best for people who are working in the same time zone as well as, in a closed space. But doing it online is quite challenging, isn't it?
I think we had a hand raised from Victoria. Have you got a question, Victoria?
You can unmute yourself.
Yeah.
You're still on mute, Victoria.
Yeah, sorry, there's a delay with my computer. I just wanted to add on to what Joel, Stephen, Ismail's team were talking about. I think one way that I've tried, rather than just saying, does anyone have questions, and allowing the silence to wash over us, etc. Sometimes as I try, rather than asking if there's questions, I'll ask for just, give me a quick emoji. What are you feeling about what we've just talked about, or what I just said? How is this landing with you? And I will get interesting different emojis. And so if there's some that are looking confused or defeated or sad, I'll just kind of address that and ask the students to, clarify. But another way, I've been using Blackboard, so I should mention that. But within the Blackboard Collaborate system, there's the whiteboard, which allows you just to kind of put up a blank white screen, and students can actually type or draw or do whatever they need to do. And so what I'll usually ask is, what was 1 or 2 of the key points that you just took from this segment? And so potentially, rather than asking if there are questions, it's giving the students an opportunity to kind of take a moment of silence, actually synthesize a little bit of what they've just learned, and then share that back. And then that anything that they can post or draw or whatever they put up there, I can actually address it and say, whoever said that, can you say more about it? Or if there's something that looks a little bit maybe misunderstood, I can offer a bit more clarity there as well. So there's a couple of ways, I think, based on Margaret's question, I think there's a couple of ways that we can play with it a little bit. It's not ideal, but it's been working okay.
Yeah, I do agree with that, because that kind of interacts with the student and keep them engaged rather than staying idle. At least some kind of participation will be there and a feedback. Okay. How do we identify the expertise in the students? Like, when we are doing it online, how do we find out the right talents? So basically, they say they are interested, but we don't know if they are having the right level of expertise or not. So can
So
anyone?
I can give a comment on
Yep.
that. I think this is a kind of unique situation that we've been put in. It's going to come to an end maybe in the next 3, 6, 9 months, hopefully. And so sometimes I think we try to do too much. I think we just, I like to think less is more, that we cannot replicate everything that we do in a face-to-face classroom. So things like, monitoring student learning, or expertise, as you said, and, going and sitting with them, looking at their writing or looking at their ideas. Sometimes we just accept we can't do that. And it's a different kind of learning. So in my case, I've stepped away from trying to, have a really close replication of the face-to-face experience. And in our university, we've got lots of support groups and all kinds of sort of online support systems where people are sharing ideas, how to do this, how to do this. For me, sometimes it's too much. And so, yeah, sometimes step back and accept that we can't do everything in this online environment. It's simply not possible to do it. So a lot of that monitoring of learning and expertise that you might be doing in the class normally, I maybe with a certain group of students, I won't do it, and I'll actually find another means to assess their learning outside of the in-person class, outside of the synchronous environment.
Yep. When it comes to group participation, only a few students keep participating again and again, while the remaining students, they stay back. They don't involve in anything. So we have to find ways to keep them engaged as well, because they might be feeling isolated. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, from my vantage point, I don't mind cueing a student to encourage them to share their feelings, their attitudes, and then when they do that, I tend to use a lot of positive encouragement in my posts, and then when they get that feedback and they learn that it's not punitive, more supportive, I think they do gradually build momentum. I've seen that in courses, especially with undergraduate students, where they start off slowly, they're afraid to speak, but then when they say something and you ask them to explain that a bit more, and you sort of identify with something that they're saying, or you validate them, I think it does build over time. I don't know if anybody's experienced that before, where you might have had a slow starter, but then as they become more comfortable with your presentation and your approach, they build in confidence and they start posting more. I've seen that in many course shells.
Yep, thank you. Is anyone having any other questions?
If I could ask a question, maybe of Joel, Steve, and Ismail. I know you mentioned that currently your study, you said, is sort of small qualitative at this point. Can you talk a little bit more maybe about some next steps or what you're imagining you might do with this? If you've done that already, I don't know. Just curious.
I think logistically, we're moving back to virtual, 80-90% in-person learning in September at SFU, and that's without identifying where we collected the data, but I'm talking about our own working context. And so it's there's a limited time frame. So do we want to invest time in looking for funds and applying for new ethics approval and all of that for something that may never come to fruition, because it will have changed, even if we're an isolated remote learning class, if the rest of the students' classes are going on in person, it's going to change it. So I think we're keeping it now as a kind of small scale exploratory study, but for me the interesting next step is we've developed a lot of expertise, and so have the students, about learning in this way. And it's very convenient for people in a big city or a big province. We all live in big provinces in Canada anyway. And so I'd be interested in looking at what can we take from this and what can we keep, because there's a lot of good stuff on these different online environments. And how can we shift what we're talking about today into more blended modes of delivery? So for me, that's a really interesting area, and to see how these issues around peer networking that we've been looking at, how we can strengthen them in a more blended mode. But I think there's a lot we can keep, and we're talking about this in our courses, that there's particularly in our graduate courses, our PhD programs, we're thinking about, well, actually, we're getting a lot of inquiries from people around the world. They want to take a PhD remotely because it's very difficult to come to Canada. So how can we incorporate them into a blended mode? So for me, that's a really interesting challenge that we face coming up.
Thank you.
What about Victoria and Thomas? What about future directions for your work? What are you thinking?
Yeah, well, I want to expand the research to sort of non-social science fields. I'd like to see how it works. I mentioned in the presentation about doing some type of studying a mentor constellation approach in something like IT, because I know they have a lot of remote virtual workers. And I had a student in the dissertation phase who was beginning to look at this, and I'm interested in it as well, is to see how a lot of these IT people would benefit from some type of consistent constellation group where they could just sort of meet, because it's my understanding that professionals in this field are really on an island when they work remotely and don't have this community of practice the same way that educators are more naturally aligned to wanting to be part of these types of groups. I don't think IT people, I don't want to stereotype them, but it doesn't come quite as naturally.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, I've been teaching these two courses for a couple of years now, and for the foreseeable future, in the next academic year at least, I'm imagining teaching them again. And in both cases, they've been face-to-face, and now we have that online shift. So it's become more interesting to me in terms of thinking about systems change or thinking about social impact in these STEM disciplines. And so for me, it's probably, as I go forward, go through research ethics and all those kinds of things, it'll probably be more about the context and the content as opposed to the online focus or the online delivery of that work. So I'm really interested in seeing the translation, or I guess the translatability of the technical expertise to whatever work experiences or social impact contexts the students might find themselves in. So we'll see if I can go forward with that. I'll probably be heading that way.
Yeah, and I mean that there's just one other thing that I would add, is that at SFU we've done some impact assessment where we're comparing the students who've taken our first year academic literacy program and looking at how they're performing. It's statistical quantitative data, and we're comparing it to modes of assessment. And for me, it's really interesting to track the students who have gone through remote learning, and to really look at how they're performing in courses 1 or 2 years later, and compare their GPA scores. And I know it's not scientific because there's so many factors, but we can look for patterns, and it gives us a cross section, and it gives us some insight as well into certain areas that students might be missing out on by having this exclusive remote learning, and how it affects their future studies. So we kind of have an ongoing impact assessment, which is on hold at the moment because this is such a kind of outlier period. But it'll be really interesting to track students who've taken the remote particularly the students who've missed their first year experience, which is so important, and to follow up with them in qualitative interviews and analyze their texts, etc., in their second and third years, and ask them, you know, how's it going after that first year. For me, that would be fascinating as well. But it all takes up a lot of time.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I interrupted you.
I think it's what's also interesting. I think there's actually some positives of being remote for some of these students, right? So I would say the majority of my students in these two courses come from India, Pakistan, and China. There, of course, are other countries, but these are sort of the majority. And in some cases, they're finding great value in being able to learn online while maintaining home lives or other responsibilities that they might not be able to address if they were already here in Canada. Of course, there are challenges because the goal is for them to come here. But in some cases, they've actually been able to be more present for whatever responsibilities they have at home. And that has alleviated some of their stress because they've been forced to work and learn online. So I think there's a flip side to what these students are experiencing that I don't often hear discussed, right? I think we're always, or majority of the time, we tend to be focused on, you know, the difficulties and how it's not ideal. But I think there's some silver lining somewhere that I'm hopeful, you know, in the grand scheme, folks are thinking about and trying to articulate as well.
Yeah, and I think I would add that I've just two student cases. I've had one student who said to me, I'm a really shy student and I'm antisocial, and I really like this Zoom environment because it's less intimidating for me. I don't have to socialize. And then in the classes where we collected the data, excuse me, there's often a mix of different language groups, and we have the multilingual Canadian or international students. A lot of them talk about feeling a bit intimidated if we put them to sit with native speakers because they're shy about their English or they're embarrassed about their accent. And again, they find that in some ways the Zoom, I'm using Zoom in my classes, but and most people were using Zoom when we did our research, that it in some ways it's a calmer, safer space for those students. But then I have another student who, in the middle of a class, he said, you know, sorry, my grandmother's having breathing difficulties. So I have to look after her now. And again, this is a student who's studying from home, but you know, once you're at the university in person, it is a kind of freedom away from sort of a lot of things going on at home. So it's very mixed, isn't it? In any group, you have students who see the positives and the disadvantages, and some are experiencing both. So I'm finding it's very complex and really interesting.
And it's interesting too, Steve, because in any group you have sort of the leaders who take the lead, but then you also have, because you're behind a camera, there can be even a greater amount of social loafing, if you will, you know, where they just don't just kind of hide, you know, in a sense. They can sort of, you know, chime in once in a while, you know. So I just find when I'm present, I'm aware of a person I haven't heard. I might even call out to somebody. So John or Victor, what do you think? You know, something like that. It prompts them, even though it puts them on the spot a little bit. Sometimes it shocks them into saying something, you know, and I hear their voice.
Mm. Any questions from any of our audience? I think we've still got a bit more time.
I guess we have 1 more minute left. Well, I think if there are no more questions, we can wrap up the session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It's nice meeting everybody.
Thanks everyone for attending, and it was
Be
a
safe.
nice conversation. Thank you.
Have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye-bye.
everybody. Take care.